What is up, my friends, and how's it going? And welcome to another guide of the Factional Overview series with your fellow comrades Summary. In this guide, we will be covering the fourth faction of our entire series, and that faction is going to be the Koinonia Galaton, or the Galatians. As most of you know, a while back on the YouTube community poll, I had conducted a voting in which the Galli group won, but two factions in particular, the Galatians as well as the Averni, won neck to neck, with the Galatians getting a slight edge. As a result, I decided to go over both the factions. However, in this guide, I am going to give the priority to the faction that actually won, and that is, of course, the Galatians. However, before I hop into the episode, there are a few things that I would like to share with you guys. And the first thing is that I know it has been a while since I have released this guide as promised. However, the delay has been due to real life stuff. I did come out from a very bad case of the flu. It was called the 100-day flu, for those of you who know it. So I really, although I was capable physically of recording, my voice could not handle it, and that is because I used to cough a lot, and of course that would not really make for a good video, so I could not really do much of a recording during that phase. However, once I got back into Divided Impera in particular, I had a lot of work that had kind of built up, and as most of you know, the Divided Impera team has released their 1.3.4 public beta, and of course I am doing my very best to provide my support as a mod team member, that I have recently been promoted to a mod team member instead of a sub-modder and an assist. So it's kind of nice to move up the Divided Impera ranks, and I'm really trying my best to overhaul as many unit cards as well as provide my support in terms of creation of assets and other graphical related matters that I usually provide my support for the Divided Impera team. Of course, I love this game, I love this sub-mod, and of course the main focus of this channel is all about Divided Impera and Rome 2. However, that being said and done, another of the reasons why I have been slow in releasing my videos is that quite frankly, a lot of the times I have a very how do I put this, guys? Might be noticing that I'm breaking up a lot because I'm really trying to think and word myself in a way that's that's coming across as genuine, because really I am being genuine when I'm saying that my time is being very limited as of now. I have to divide my attention, of course, with family, being a father and so forth, and of course a part of the reason that actually prevents me from releasing guides is that I do have an OCD kind of a tendency, and I like to release things with a fairly standard format. And of course, my original intention, especially for my Let's Play series, was to have those introduction videos, and which I recently had to discontinue, of course. As most of you have seen with my Let's Play Seleucid guides, I haven't really had those introduction videos with those map animations and so forth, because frankly speaking, those videos actually take upwards of 2 to 3 hours to actually create, with all the narration, the map animation, the graphics and so forth, and unfortunately I don't really have that time to spare. And that being said, speaking of the map animation, that's another reason that's actually holding me back from releasing Factional Overview guide series, and that is because, if you guys remember, in the old format, we had part 4 of the series in which I would be talking about my personal recommendations for mercenary and AOR units while displaying their relevant locations on the map and their proximity to your starting position. However, going forward, I am going to exclude that from my series, because once again, even that animation does take upwards of 1 to 2 hours to actually create in the software that I use, and it's not really a software issue. I pretty much am aware that even if I change the software that I'm using, it's going to take about that much time, because I have to get all of the individual components required for that video. I have to record the audio separately, and I'll have to time it with the zooming in and the zooming out, and it's really an intense procedure, guys. And I really wish I could continue it, but unfortunately my hands are tied. So I'm really going to release to you the remaining parts of the guide, which is basically part 1, where we will look at the in-depth roster for the faction, in this case the Galatians, of course. Part 2, which is going to be my personal recommended army composition for the faction. Part 3, we are going to be using that army composition against a typical Roman Marian legionary army, and in my opinion, I use this army as the benchmark because, as most of you know, Divided Impera, the endgame faction that you're going to be facing is Roman AI, and most of the time the Roman AI at this point of time should have triggered their Marian reforms, so more than likely you will be fighting Roman Marian legions, and here and there the one-off remnant Polybian armies of the Romans that still end up being around or surviving up till that endgame. And the reason being is because for some reason the AI is not really that good. In particular, the Roman AI is not really that good at upgrading their units into Marian units, and I really wish the Divided Impera, it's not my scope as far as my contribution is concerned to the mod, but it is a scope that I really wish to be given some attention by the Divided Impera team. And of course, the final part, which is the 5th part, which will be bumped up to the 4th part of the guide, is my personal recommendations for your general skills and your army tradition skills, keeping in mind the playstyle for the faction in question. However, without further ado, I know it has been a long introduction, let us hop right into the Koinon Galaton. Now, the Koinon Galaton is one of the 3 Celtic factions within the Galli faction group, the 3 Celtic factions being the Scordisci, the Boii, and of course the Galatians, as we are discussing. The other 2 factions, the Nervii and the Averni, are actually Gallic culture, which means they can confederate with each other, but they cannot confederate with the Celti faction groups. However, they are all lumped up as Galli as far as the faction group is concerned. And as a Galli faction group, you get 2 buffs: the Gallic horsemanship, which is +1 experience rank for all Gallic cavalry recruits. This is not really that powerful in my opinion. It's nice to have, but it's not really game breaking, and especially as the Galatians, since you have really poor cavalry, so you will be having to rely a lot on mercenary cavalry, or at the very best you're gonna have to fight with your cavalry in a very, very asymmetric fashion, guys. So not really that great for the Galatians. However, it's good for some other factions that are cavalry, that have decent cavalry, like the Nervii and the Averni. And next up you have the Druidic culture, and now this gives increased population from temples when the culture is dominant, and this, in my opinion, is a quite good long-lasting buff that is relevant both in the early game as well as in the late game, and that is because temples usually give a boost to your 1st and 2nd class population, and as mentioned, your 1st and 2nd class population is really, really important for building up professional armies, is really important for your ability in replenishing armies. And if you know me personally, in terms of how I view the game, especially in the campaign versus the AI, it's all about keeping that momentum in your offensive campaigns, in your offensive wars. It's about maximizing your replenishment, making sure that you're able to push far and deep and quickly into the enemy territory and quickly stamp out the enemy before they can mount a meaningful resistance against you. I really try my level best, especially in my playthroughs, to avoid a stalemate, and something like population is, in my opinion, one of the main defining factors of how good you are going to be in the campaign when it comes to your military or offensive capabilities, and which is one of the reasons why in my faction tier list Rome ranks 1, because a majority of the Roman army, at least 80 to 90% of your Roman army, is going to come from Pop 3 and Pop 4, especially once you trigger the Marian reforms. However, that being said and done, this particular buff is especially powerful for the Galatians. Not that it has a different effect for the other factions, but when it comes to the Galatians, it's absolutely crucial, because unlike the other Galli factions, you are not surrounded by any Celtic culture. You are in fact a new entry into Anatolia. You basically invaded into Anatolia in 279 BC, and of course a year later is the start date for Divided Impera campaign, so your Celtic presence in the region is not that much. You are surrounded mostly by Persian Daco-Thracian as well as Hellenic culture, and as such your early expansion is going to be really painful because you're not going to be able to replenish that quickly. Most of the settlements you take will be of foreign culture, which means you will not gain the population within that settlement. Instead, the entire population within that settlement will be converted into foreign population. So it goes without saying, in the early game you really want to maximize and focus on building up armies that revolve around foreign as well as population class 3, which are easier to replenish and recruit. And then of course, as the game progresses and you have more Celtic culture in the region, then you can slowly start to professionalize your armies once your population class 2 and population class 3 has built up to a significant amount. However, that being said and done, let us move on to the personal faction buffs and debuffs for the Galatians. As the typical rule in Divided Impera, you get 2 buffs and a debuff. Let us go with the buffs first. You have 2 buffs: the Price of Freedom, which gives increased captive income, and Plunderers, which gives increased income from raiding and sacking. And usually I go through them one by one, but the reason I mention both of them within the same breath is, as you can tell, both of them are very closely related. They kind of push you into a playstyle that focuses around rampaging and pillaging your way, basically a scorched earth policy on the entirety of Anatolia and consolidating your hold over Anatolia with an iron fist. And this actually is not really that powerful in the late game, because increased income from captives really in the later stages of the game, incomes from captives is not really going to be that much of a big deal. When your economy is making 150 to 200,000 denarii per turn, an additional 1 or 2,000 denarii from fighting a battle is not going to make that much of a difference in that phase of the game. The same goes with, of course, Plunderers, raiding and sacking and looting a settlement, which gives typically 15 to 30,000 denarii. With this buff, of course, is quite powerful in the early game, but of course in the late game 30,000 denarii versus 200,000 denarii is nothing. It's pretty much just 15%. It is a nice boost still, but of course it's not that powerful as it would be in the early game. But as the Galatians, these 2 buffs are quite nice, because once again you're surrounded by foreign culture, which means there isn't really an incentive for peacefully occupying a settlement. Instead, you'd rather go with the other options, which are looting, raiding, sacking, basically being as barbarianly possible. And what this means is that you're also going to be gaining quite a lot of cash at hand from your early expansion, which means you can really sustain a lot of mercenaries, which again ties into the population debuff that you're going to be facing, especially in the early game. However, for your debuff, you have the increased construction times. Basically what this does is that it adds a +1 construction time needed for all buildings within your building roster, so to speak. Once again, this really impacts you in the early game, not so much in the late game, for several reasons. In the early game, where you really need to start building up your provinces, of course time is of the essence, and the sooner you build a temple, the sooner you're able to convert a province, the sooner you build a food, you're able to build up your food surplus, the sooner you're able to build military buildings, the sooner you're able to get access to better military units. And of course, being able to do it slower in the early game is going to impact you. Of course, once again, it is making you focus on relying on mercenary units and so forth. So once again, you can see that even though these buffs and debuffs not really that powerful in the late game, they're very significant in the early game, and they're really pushing you towards playing the Galatians in a very specific kind of a way, and I kind of like to see that. However, in the late game, with the hindered development, of course it's not going to impact you as much. You will have built up most of your provinces, most of your other settlements are going to be in the process of building up, so there's no real need to get buildings as immediately as it is in the early game. And on top of that, when we take the comparative increment in the late game versus the early game in terms of your construction times, that comparative increment is obviously going to reduce drastically, because in the late game most of your buildings, which are tier 4 buildings, are going to take anywhere between 16 to 24 turns to build. Adding an additional turn to this building time requirement isn't that much of an increment. Think about it. When you talk about 16 versus 17, that's basically less than a 10% increase. So that's about a 7% increase in time required to build a building. When you're talking about 24 turns to build versus 25 turns, that is less than 5%. A 5% increment to your building time required. However, in the early game, where most of your buildings take about 4 turns to build, you're bumping it up from 4 to 5 turns. Now this is a 25% increment. So as you can see, once again, this debuff is significantly going to impact you in the early game. However, since we have covered the introduction for the Galatian faction, let us hop into part 1 of the guide, in which I will be covering the roster available to the Galatian faction in depth. Alright, welcome to part 1 of the guide, in which we will be covering the roster available to the Galatians in depth. Before I hop in, you guys might notice that the unit cards are different to what they appear in your game, and that is because I am really trying to overhaul all of the unit cards for Divided Impera as much as I possibly can. And of course, as you can tell, the main focus of my vision is to properly showcase the role, the equipment of each of the units. As you can tell, you can see their weapons, their armor, the shields, and of course, based on the poses, you can also kind of guess from a glance what that unit is capable of in the battlefield. As you can see, phalanx type units have that phalanx formation, which makes them stand out versus other purely spear units. Like for example, you have the Galatian Shield Wall Spearmen versus of course the Galatian Turius Spearmen. Straight off the bat, just by looking at them, you can tell that even though they are similarly armored and have similar equipment, one is a phalanx unit, the other one is just purely a spear unit. Of course, if you take a look at the Galatian Naked Warriors, you can see that they are a bit more mobile. They have javelins as well as a spear, because they are kind of like a hybrid javelin spear unit. If you take a look at a couple of these cavalry units, you can tell straight off the bat the Galatian Bodyguard is a spear and shield cavalry. Meanwhile, the Galatian Noble Cavalry is a sword cavalry. So that is pretty much the vision that I have for overhauling all of the unit cards in Divided Impera. And this is a massive vision, guys. It's not that easy to implement, because there are over more than 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 unit cards, and of course overhauling all of them is going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. Of course, the main focus is to overhaul the unit cards for the playable factions, after which I will be focusing on the AI factions. As most of you know, some of the AI factions use really outdated Divided Impera cards that don't really fit even with the appearance of the current the current norm for Divided Impera cards. And of course, after that, we'll be focusing on the AOR and mercenary units as well. So quite a lot of cards to do, guys. And to any of those of you who are willing to volunteer their help, just hit me up on Discord. I have private YouTube videos in which I explain how to create unit cards for units. And of course, typically speaking, each faction takes about 5 hours for me to make, 4 to 5 hours for me to make. However, with help, I can cut that down to 2 hours, which means I can do a lot more factions, which means in the same amount of time I would take to do 1 factions, I can do 2, possibly even 3 factions in that same amount of time. However, that being said and done, lastly, I would like to give out a special shout out for an Optimate, who is a member of the YouTube community and of course is a member of the Discords, both of Divided Impera and of course my own personal Discord. And he has really helped me overhaul a lot of unit cards. And as you can tell in the patch 1.3.4 public beta, which will soon be integrated into the main Divided Impera mod, I have gone ahead and overhauled quite a lot of factions. I have overhauled the Boii, the Nervi, the Averni, the Galatians, as you can tell right here. Of course, I have also overhauled the Arevaci, the Lusitani, the Editani, and of course the Mamlakatan Nabata and we are focusing on the Dacians, the Getaeans, as well as the Kartli. So quite a lot of factions, guys, and if you basically just add it all up, it's to me personally could take anywhere between 100 hours to fulfill. But if you guys volunteer and I can basically bifurcate and spread out the work, then I can pretty much get it done in a much shorter amount of time, less than 50% of the time that it would require. And I will be guiding you guys, I will be holding your hands throughout the entire journey, teaching you how to make these unit cards, how to help me make them. And of course with that we can have a much more polished game in terms of visual appeal, as well as, you know, the practicality of having unit cards that basically give the end user a glimpse of what the unit is capable of, simply by looking at the unit cards without having to dive into the detailed stats, so to speak. However, that being said and done, I do apologize. I haven't really been focusing on the guide since it has been a long time since I've released a factional overview guide series. I am kind of also explaining some general things, but without any further ado, let us hop into an in-depth analysis of the roster available to the Galatian faction. As you can see, I have gone ahead and arranged my army in that typical formation with generals in group 1, followed by a melee infantry, spear infantry, phalanx infantry, missile infantry, melee cavalry, missile cavalry, and special units, which in the case of the Galatians are the chariots available to the Galatian faction. And straight off the bat you can tell that, you know, the Galatians are a melee infantry heavy faction. As you can tell, we have more melee infantry than any other units in the game. Of course, all of the other units are significantly less in comparison to our melee infantry, and this in comparison to some of the other factions that we have covered so far, namely Sparta, Carthage, and of course the Bactrians. The Galatians have a very small roster, considering in fact 2 of these melee units are actually repeated units over here in your general options. So so the Galatians are really limited in their roster, but that doesn't mean, initially I thought this meant that the Galatians have a weak roster, but they actually have a really strong roster. If you play to their strengths, they basically kind of force you, and this is why I like the Divided Impera team. They're very smart about how to make factions kind of have a purpose in the campaign and kind of fit a particular kind of narrative and playstyle. And the Galatians have a very particular playstyle focused around melee heavy infantry with a good bunch of support units, and of course focusing on maneuverability rather than hammer and anvil tactics. That being said and done, let us hop into the first category, is the generals category. All of these units are going to be coming from population class 1 or the nobility class, and the very first unit that we have over here is the Galatian noble spearmen. Now these guys are 200 men strong. They are a phalanx type unit with the barbarian shield wall ability. As you can tell, being a Galatian unit surrounded by Hellenic factions, they do have a little bit of a Hellenic cultural influence in their appearance. But let's just quickly go over their stats. They have 9 melee attack, 21 melee defense, armor of 38, overall weapon damage of 30, which is good in my books because I consider overall weapon damage to be the benchmark of whether a unit has good weapon damage that can actually dish out some punishment. And of course in the case of the Galatian noble spearmen, you have that. These guys, being a phalanx type spear wielding unit, has a bonus versus elephants and cavalry, no bonus whatsoever versus infantry. Would I recommend these guys as a general on the field of battle? Absolutely not, because they have really slow movement speed. If you have the option of cavalry units, then definitely roll with cavalry units, because the main focus of the battlefield as a general unit is to have mobility, so that you can move to trouble spots within the battlefield, rally, inspire, and provide buffs to units, as well as if you are caught in a very dicey situation. Let's say you're fighting off against a low tier level unit and nothing seems to be going wrong, you're easily going to be winning that engagement. However, you have been recharged by a group of light cavalrymen. These guys are not going to be able to escape that situation because they run really slow, and what that means is that you're more than likely going to end up losing your general on the battlefield, which will apply an overall morale penalty to your entire army. as of which or due to which you might actually end up losing the battle. So once again, wouldn't really recommend these guys as a general for field battles. However, you can still recruit them as governor generals. In fact, I would highly advise you to recruit them as governor generals for two reasons. One is that infantry units typically tend to be cheaper than cavalry units, which means you're not really maintaining them with too much upkeep cost. But two, a phalanx type unit like this is actually really powerful in settlements because they're able to hold choke points and they can pretty much engage in any unit in a frontal attack, as long as you're protected on the sides by walls within a narrow opening or a road within the settlement. You're pretty much going to be undefeatable from the front, with the exception of course of pike units, because pike units kind of have a range or a reach advantage versus your spear type hoplite phalanx or shield wall units. So once again, very good unit to be using as a governor general, but definitely do not use it as a general on the field of battle. Next up, we have the Galatian chosen swordsmen. Now these guys are really good swordsmen. They come with 15 melee attack, which means they have really high melee attack for a swords unit, 12 melee defense, which means they are also quite defensively oriented as a sword unit. They do have massive shields, as you can tell. These are basically the barbarian type oval shields that were adopted by Hellenic factions later on in the time frame that we are speaking of. And of course, as you can see, they do have some of that Hellenic cultural influence in their shield designs, their helmets and so forth. So visually a very nice looking unit overall. However, when we look at their weapon damage, 32 overall weapon damage, that is absolutely amazing. Only 2 of which comes from armor penetration, so these guys are not going to be that good against heavily armored opponents, but they are pretty much going to shred through lightly armored opposition. They do come with a bonus versus infantry as well. And how does bonus versus anything kind of works? So in this case, +1 bonus versus infantry adds on to your melee attack, bumping it up from 15 to 16. It also adds on to your melee defense, bumping it up from 12 to 13. It adds on to your overall weapon damage and is actually split between your melee armor piercing value as well as your base weapon damage. But in this case, since the base damage is so much more than your armor piercing damage, then the split is actually heavily favoring the weapon damage. So it pretty much bumps up your weapon damage to 31, your melee armor piercing damage stays at 2, and your overall weapon damage gets bumped up to 33. They have decent armor, 35 armor. It's the third best armor value available to infantry units in the game. The first best being 41, the second best being 38. 35 is actually really good, and a lot of units are going to be below you in terms of armor value. Speed of 2 means they are also not going to be really good on the field of battle as a general. And of course, they do not have a precursor javelin, which is rather a shame because it was always nice to have a precursor javelin. That being said, we have the next unit, which is your Galatian thorax infantry. Now, as the Galatians, you have 2 reforms, which is kind of unique for a barbarian faction, because most barbarian factions have access to the Nitos reforms, which is the barbarian reform, which unlocks once you hit Imperium level 4 at turn 90. But the Galatians additionally also get access to the Hellenic thorax reforms, which kind of trigger once you hit Imperium level 5 and once you reach turn 120, which is kind of interesting. And as you can see, they're very Hellenic, Celtic blend of a unit, which kind of makes sense because they are a thorax unit, which is kind of inspired by the Hellenic thorax reform. Now, what these guys are basically a direct upgrade of your Galatian chosen swordsmen. As such, their melee attack, melee defense, and weapon damage stats are exactly identical. Where they differ is that they have a little bit more armor, 41 armor. They also have a precursor javelin, which is really nice. And most importantly, they have the defensive formation, which only adds buffs to the units, guys. Now, as you can see with the defensive formation, you get an additional bonus versus infantry. You also get +5 bonus versus elephant and cavalry, which is quite useful when you are engaging against cavalry units. But the best buff of all is that you're getting an additional 15 armor value to your base armor rating, bumping it up to 56 armor value. Now this is really high armor value for an infantry unit because as I mentioned before, 41 is the absolute best armor value that you can get for an infantry unit. 56 is actually comparable to some of the heaviest cataphract units in the game, such as the Nicaean cavalry available to the Seleucids and Parthians, and of course some of the heavy cataphract units of the eastern factions. Your swordsmen are basically as heavily armored as them. Of course, once they're in this formation, they're going to get some significant penalties if they are flanked. And since they also have slow movement speed, once again, I wouldn't recommend to use this unit as a general on the field of battle. Instead, I would recommend using this as a governor general. They can in fact even replace your Galatian noble spearmen in the late game as governor generals, because even though they will not have the reach advantage of a phalanx type unit, they do have a lot more armor, which means they are a lot more sustainable in a prolonged fight. And of course they will be really important in holding choke points, since they do have a formation kind of an attack, namely the defensive formation. That being said and done, the last two options for your generals are two cavalry options. When it comes to these two cavalry options, they are no-brainer, because of course you want your cavalry options to kind of be the only options that you're going to go for because of that mobility reason. And when it comes to these two options, they are so similar that I am going to be going through them side by side. The first option you have is your Galatian noble cavalry. Second option you have is your Galatian bodyguard. So let's look at the stats in which they are similar. As you can tell, they have the same armor value at 38. They have the same speed at 6, which is rather slow considering their armor value. Some of your neighbors, such as the Seleucids, the Pergamese, the Bithynians, the Armenians, the Persians, they have heavier cavalry that can move just as fast. So your cavalry is not going to be better than theirs. In fact, your cavalry is going to be worse than theirs. However, that being said, let's talk about their major differences. The major difference is the weapons that they use, and this is what affects the role that they will play on the battlefield. So with the case of the Galatian bodyguard, you have a spear unit, and what this means is that they have lower melee attack, better melee defense, and a better bonus versus cavalry. In the case of your Galatian noble cavalry, you have a sword cavalry, which means they're going to have a bit more melee attack, slightly lower melee defense, and of course a focus versus infantry. So it's really up to you which unit you'd like to use. But considering what I said about enemy cavalry being superior to your own cavalry, the obvious choice would be to fight asymmetrically. So whenever you have a quality advantage, then you want to fight fire with fire. So let's say you have better cavalry than the enemy cavalry, then you want to engage in those cav versus cav engagement. However, if your cavalry is inferior to enemy cavalry, then you want to avoid that situation as much as possible. You want to focus on promoting your strengths and denying the enemy their strengths. So in my personal opinion, I would go for the Galatian noble cavalry, because once again, as mentioned with the other general units, I do not want my general to be in a sticky situation. And of course, if I play with the Galatian bodyguards, then I am going to be focusing on anti-cavalry engagements. That's where they kind of shine, but once again, they're not going to be able to shine because your neighbors have better cavalry than your own, which means they are going to be, instead of shining, they're going to be in a sticky situation. They're not going to be able to escape. And keep in mind, escaping or trying to pull out of an engagement is an extremely risky thing to do, especially with cavalry, because as your cavalry is running away, the enemy cavalry can continue to pursue you, and when they pursue you, they're going to be dishing out some serious casualties. It's almost considered as though your cavalry is routing, and if they are able to keep up with you for long enough, then your cavalry will actually rout, and once again you stand the risk of losing your general. Meanwhile, if you do use the Galatian noble cavalry, which is a swords unit, then of course your focus is going to be countering enemy infantry, and the obvious choice here is to attack enemy missile infantry, rear charge on enemy front lines. So no real threat to your general. Your general can easily move out of the confrontation and can easily jump back into it when the moment best suits him, and as such your general is going to be a lot more effective on the field of battle, and that is why I'd primarily focus on the Galatian noble cavalry. Of course, if they are going to be performing rear charges, keep in mind they're not going to be as good as the Galatian bodyguard, and that is because the Galatian bodyguard, being a spear cavalry unit, will have a better charge bonus as opposed to sword units that have a significantly lower charge bonus. However, in patch 1.3.4 Divided Impera, rear charges and flankings are a lot more powerful, which means even a melee sword unit charging into the backs of an enemy can quickly rout or waver that unit. So this kind of adds lethality, I would say. It adds lethality to, shock units as well as, spear, lancers and so forth. However, it also takes away from their unique role, because pretty much any unit can, create the intended effect of a rout with rear charges, and it's not just anymore exclusive to shock units, in my opinion. However, of course, shock units are going to be able to do it much faster and rack up a lot more kills much faster than, of course, units that are not dedicated for shock. That being said and done, let us move on to the next section, where we will be talking about the cream of the Galatian roster, which is their melee infantry. And as I mentioned before, when it comes to their melee infantry, we have two options that are basically a repeat of your general option, so I will not be covering them. They're basically the third option, the Galatian Chosen Swordsmen, and of course the fourth option, the Galatian Thorax Infantry. Both come from that first class population, and as such, not really, we're not really going to be discussing them, because they're pretty much the identical thing to the general variants that we discussed earlier. However, the first unit that we have available are your Galatian Swordsmen. 300 men per unit, comes from that population class 3, and as such is incredibly important, especially in the early game, as the Galatians, as I mentioned, you are surrounded by foreign culture. You do not have access to a lot of population class 1 and population class 2, so sticking to population class 3 and population class 4 is the way to go, especially if you're raiding and pillaging and sacking your way. You're going to have a lot of denarii to sustain merc heavy armies, and you're going to be able to expand a lot quickly as the Galatians if you follow that strategy in mind. However, that being said and done, population class 3 unit, they do have an armor value of 10, which is really low. Quite obviously, these guys are not frontline units, so don't use them as such. They are going to be really good flanking units. They do come with a precursor javelin, and it might seem to be something that's normal for sword infantry, but keep in mind that number of 300 with a javelin is almost the equivalent of a 175 man strong skirmisher unit, which is the typical size of a skirmisher unit, throwing 2 javelins. So 175 times 2 is 350 javelins, and of course 300 times 1 is 300 javelins, so it's almost the equivalent of a purely dedicated skirmisher unit throwing 2 javelins. And as far as timing is concerned, then these guys throw all of their javelins in one volley, so it's almost twice the damage of purely skirmisher units delivered in half the amount of time. So that's just how powerful it is. That's the way you guys should see it. And apart from that, their melee stats are actually amazing, considering they are population class 3 unit. When it comes to the Galatians, this is one of my 3 favorite units in the Galatian roster. Definitely, as you can tell, their melee attack is really good, 13 and 10 when it comes to melee attack and defense respectively, which is comparable to your population class 1 Galatian Chosen Swordsman, 15 and 12 versus 13 and 10. So you can see the difference is not that much. And of course, when you talk about the weapon damage, 28 base and 2 melee armor piercing versus 30 base and 2 melee armor piercing. So they're almost the same in terms of melee capabilities to the Galatian Chosen Swordsmen, which are actually an elitist unit. The only thing they lack is, of course, their armor value. In fact, if they did have higher armor value, I would even consider them to be as closely related to your Galatian Chosen Swordsmen. But of course, your Galatian Swordsmen are going to be really cost effective. They're quite cheap. They are levy tiered, which means you can get levy buffs if you select some general skills that boost your levy capabilities. So as such, a very good unit, definitely my 3rd most favorite unit in the Galatian roster, so to speak. Next up, we have the 200 men population class 2 Galatian Axemen. These guys are an interesting unit. They are similar to one of my favorite AOR and mercenary units, the Agrarian Axemen or the Agrarian Sellswords. They are slightly different, however. They have a bit more armor, 30 armor versus 20. However, their melee capabilities are slightly less in comparison to the Agrianian Axemen. They have 9 instead of 11 melee attack. They have 11 instead of 13 melee defense, and their overall weapon damage is at 35. As opposed to 20, which the as opposed to 37, which is what the Agrianian Axemen have. Basically, they have 19 base melee weapon damage versus 20 of the Agrianian Axemen. They have 14 melee armor piercing versus 15, and the bonus stays the same at about 2. And what's interesting to note is, as I mentioned, the bonus is split evenly between the melee weapon damage as well as the armor piercing damage based on the ratio. And as you can tell, the ratio is almost 1:1. So 19:14 is almost 1:1. All right. So what that means is that the bonus versus infantry is divided evenly, bumping up your base weapon damage to 20, your armor piercing to 15, and 15 armor piercing is really, really good considering your neighbors have heavily armored units. You're dealing with Hellenic factions like the Seleucids, the Pergamon faction, the Lydians. Of course, you will also be dealing with the Pontic faction, Armenian factions, the list goes on. You have a lot of heavily armored units, and these guys are going to be a very good counter. Now, you can use them as front of the line units because they have big shields, and of course they have a lot of armor, but their melee defense value is rather low, so I would not really recommend using them as frontline units. Instead, they do have a really high speed, as well as that precursor javelin. So these guys, like Agrianian Axemen, are mainly focused on flanking maneuvers rather than frontline units. What I would say is that in the early game you can use Galatian swordsmen as your main flanking units. However, later on, as you progress through the campaign and you have access to more population class 2 units, definitely rely on these bad boys. Next up, and the third final option that is unique in terms of the melee infantry, is the Nitos, or the Galatian legionaries. And now these guys unlock during the Nitos reforms, as the name suggests, which happens at about Imperium level 4 and turn 90. Now these guys are my second favorite unit when it comes to the Galatian roster, and that is because they are very similar to Roman legionaries, and it's really nice to see the Galatians have that historical imitation legionary, since they were an ally of the Romans. They were kind of trained in the Roman way of fighting, and now these guys, although they are like Roman legionaries, they do have a few key differences. However, in terms of similarities, they have the same armor value, they have the same speed, the precursor javelin, decent morale, and of course all of the Roman legionary formations, including the hollow square, defensive formation, defensive testudo, and reform the line ability. But the major difference is that while the Roman legions tend to be a bit more defensive oriented, these guys are a bit more attack oriented. So their melee attack is 13 versus the Roman cohorts, which has 11. Their melee defense, however, is slightly lower at 12 versus 15 for the Romans. Their weapon damage, however, is overall it's the same, 28 and 2, which totals up to 30, which is the same as the Romans. However, the Romans kind of enjoy a little bit more armor piercing value. The Roman kind of division is 26 base and 4 armor piercing. So the Romans are a little bit better when it comes to armor piercing as opposed to your Galatian legionaries. Now, if I have to say, or put a scenario in which Galatian legionaries are going to fight head to head against Roman legionaries, then these guys are going to lose because they have slightly lower defense as opposed to the Roman legionaries. But more importantly, they also lack in that armor piercing, because in an engagement against 2 very heavily armored units, your defense value as well as your armor piercing value is going to make a significant difference, because your defense value basically means how well you're going to be able to dodge the enemy attacks, or block or parry the enemy attacks. And of course, your armor piercing means how much damage you're going to be able to inflict every time you do manage to land an attack on the enemy. So as such, in a head-to-head confrontation, as you will see in part 3 of this guide, Galatian legionaries are going to be at a slight disadvantage in comparison to your Roman legionaries. Now, these guys 200 men strong. Another disadvantage they have versus Roman legionaries is that Roman legionaries actually come from population class 3. These guys come from your population class 2. So in my opinion, that is the most significant drawback of these units. But apart from that, they're still a very, very good unit. They're better than most population class 2 swordsmen out there, so definitely recommend these guys, especially in that defensive formation. They're going to get an additional 15 armor, 53 armor, so really, really good unit over here. So that being said and done, let's move on to the third part, which is basically your spearmen. Now, spearmen, you have three options. The first option is Galatian light spearmen, 300 men per unit. Pretty much a very standard population class 3 spearmen. Very mediocre stats, nothing all that amazing. Overall weapon damage of 26, which is shy of that baseline 30 that I consider to be a good indicator of how good a unit it is. But in the early game, this unit is kind of going to be like your meat shield. They're going to be kind of trying to hold your line, while of course your Galatian swordsmen are going to try to flank around the enemy units. And keep in mind, when you flank around the enemy units, you want to be in as narrow a formation as possible, because you're going to be able to maneuver a lot better than trying to wheel around really slow like this. However, as you can imagine, if the formation is narrow, you're going to be able to turn a lot faster. However, that being said and done, very typical spear unit. Unlike the Galatian swordsmen, which are an exceptional population class 3 swordsmen, the Galatian light spearmen, not that exceptional. However, they do have an armor of 8, which should kind of increase their longevity in battle. Not by that much, but of course it should be enough. And of course they do have a speed of 3, which means once again you're going to be focusing on trying to gain an upper hand as far as engaging the enemy is concerned, because keep in mind, your enemy once again is a lot of Hellenic factions with a lot of phalanx type units. So of course you want to try to flank them when you engage them. You don't want to fight them head on, as obviously you're going to lose that engagement. But another thing to their advantage is that they are relatively a looser formation, so they're not going to be taking too many casualties from phalanx types units, especially if you're able to relieve them quickly. Next up, we have the Galatian Turius spearmen. As the name suggests, they should be unlocked during the Turius reforms, but as a barbarian faction, you do not have access to the Turius reforms. Instead, these guys get unlocked during the Nitos reforms, which is the first of the 2 reforms you have available as the Galatian factions. They're 300 men per unit, again coming from that population class 3, which is really, really good. And as a population class 3 unit, they're actually really good. They come with a precursor javelin, 25 armor, decent melee attack and melee defense, good overall weapon damage at 29, 5 of which is armor piercing. Of course, they have a bonus versus cavalry and elephants. So in the mid game, I would say, these guys would combine well with your Galatian axemen. In the early game, the light spearmen with the Galatian swordsmen. So you see that trend kind of continues. Once again, you're going to focus on your maneuverability, because you're not going to be able to fight off phalanx units head on. You're going to have to be able to flank them. And another good thing about being a 300 man unit is that before you engage a phalanx type unit, if you manage to isolate it, you want to spread out and then issue the attack order, so that these guys can pretty much just surround or wrap around the enemy phalanx unit and kind of trigger that formation breached debuff, which significantly nerfs phalanx types units. So these guys are quite good in comparison to the Hellenic Turios spearmen. They are very similar in terms of stats. So once again, would recommend using these units in the middle game. However, the next unit we are going to talk about are the Galatian Naked Warriors. I do apologize if you can see their nudity. I am playing with a submod that I find a lot more immersive, which is not available on Steam for obvious reasons, but it is available on the Discord server, and you kind of have to download and install it manually. For those of you who don't know how to do that, just check out my guide on how to manually install mods. But that being said and done, this unit right here is my number 1 unit when it comes to the Galatian faction, and that is because they are an incredibly versatile unit. They have 14 melee attack as a spear unit, which is really, really high. 15 melee defense, so these guys actually have a shock spear entry. Overall weapon damage of 31, 6 of which is armor piercing. Of course, they have a bonus versus cavalry and elephants, not against infantry. They have 8 armor despite being in the nude, and that's because they have a couple of helmets on. And of course, they have a speed of 3, but more importantly, they have an ammunition of 4. Now, what this means is these guys, 200 men strong, coming from that population class 2, with 4 javelins, that totals up to 800 javelins in this unit. So now if I were to compare for a quick second over here, let's hop onto the Galatian skirmishers. These guys are 175 men strong, and they have 6 javelins. So if we do the math, let's say 2 volleys equals to 350, and you have a total of 3 such volleys. So you're looking at 900 plus 150. So you're looking at about 1050 javelins in this purely skirmisher type unit that has no melee capabilities whatsoever. Versus, of course, when it comes to the Galatian naked warriors, you have 800 javelins, which is similar, almost similar. It's just 200 javelins shy of your purely dedicated skirmishers, but they have insane melee capabilities. So these guys are incredibly powerful. The only thing, in my opinion, they kind of lack is that most of the naked units in the game come with the scare ability. These guys come with the impetuous ability, which gives a little bit more morale when eager, and eager is kind of like your stat over here. As you can see, it's right now at fresh, but once you kind of get close to the enemy unit, you will be eager. So yeah, in my as you can see over here, they're already impetuous. Okay, that's kind of nice. Sorry, fresh is more of their stamina, whereas impetuous is more of their morale bonus. However, yeah, it's not really that big of a deal as compared to the scare ability, which is much more powerful in my opinion. But even without the scare ability, these guys are absolutely amazing. And another thing I would like to say about these guys is that they are going to be really crucial in your asymmetric kind of a tactical warfare in the battle. Next up, we have our phalanx type units, Galatian shield wall spearmen. They are population class 2 unit with about 200 men in the unit. They are slightly inferior, of course, to your Galatian noble spearmen, which are population class 1, so definitely more elitist. As far as stats are concerned, I'm not going to go through them individually because they're pretty much very typical of a pop 2 class barbarian shield wall unit, so nothing much to discuss there. Would I recommend using this unit? Of course, they're going to be a frontline unit if you do decide to use them, and they kind of unlock in the earlier parts of the game, so they're not really locked behind any reform, so you can get access to these guys. So once again, would I recommend using them as a frontline unit? Considering your neighbors have better hoplite units and of course better phalanx type units such as pike phalangites and short pike phalangites, these guys are not going to be able to do much, especially since they have a really low armor. So I wouldn't really recommend using these guys as a frontline unit. However, if you're going up against some Daco-Thracian tribes, if you do decide to expand northwards, then these guys are quite useful. Of course, if you are deciding to go up against nomadic horse archers, then these guys are going to be once again useful because that shield wall formation does give an extra bonus versus missiles. Of course, they're not going to be able to catch up to horse archers quite obviously, but they're going to be able to better tank those missile damage, and then eventually when the enemy cavalry runs out of missiles and they decide to engage in melee, these guys are going to be much better equipped to fending off cavalry charges because they have a lot more density. However, versus superior phalangite, these guys are going to get absolutely shredded because they don't have a loose formation. They're not going to be able to wrap around. They're kind of tightly packed in, as you can see over here, so that means they're going to be up against more spearheads, so to speak. And what that means is that these guys are going to get absolutely shredded in a toe-to-toe confrontation against your Hellenic neighbors. So wouldn't recommend using them against Hellenic neighbors, but against the Daco-Thracian North, the factions which have primarily a lot of sword or melee infantry, these guys are going to be able to defend against them effectively because they have a reach advantage versus sword units. So yeah, it really depends on what kind of adversary you're up against. Against the Romans, these guys could be quite useful as well. However, of course, I would say the main frontline unit, especially in the late game, by far is going to be your Galatian legionaries, because once again you can play in a fashion very similar to the Roman faction, where you have about 10 of these guys, as a cohort of 10, or perhaps even less, depending on how versatile you want your army to be. And these guys can do quite well, since of course your legionary units are some of the most versatile units in game. Next up, we are going to talk about our missile infantry, and actually, we're not going to talk about our missile infantry. All of them are 175 men strong, and all of them have one thing in common: mediocre stats, and they are absolutely garbage. They have no melee capabilities, as you can see over here. Absolutely non-existent melee capabilities, and absolutely horrific missile capabilities as well. When you take a look at the Galatian archers, 14 missile damage, incredibly low. 155 range, once again incredibly low. 5 shots per minute, once again incredibly low. But they are incredibly garbage, so definitely do not get these guys. The skirmishers, once again, you might want to get them in the early game when you are struggling for that population class, but once you get access to population class 2, then it's a no-brainer. You want the Galatian naked warriors instead. As far as the last and final option is concerned, these are your slingers. Once again, absolutely trash. They are pretty much mediocre in terms of stats, no melee capabilities whatsoever. But between your archers and your slingers, which are the only two long-range options that you have, I would roll with the slingers. Simply because slingers, they tend to be slower, so they have 5 shots per minute versus archers that tend to be faster, but these archers have the same garbage shots per minute. Next up, the slingers have a much more significant range, 190 versus 155. Slingers have better armor piercing, which is kind of useful against the factions you're running up against, such as the heavily armored Diadochi. Archers, meanwhile, have higher overall weapon damage or missile damage. But in the case of the Galatians, the archers do not have that much more overall missile damage in comparison to your slingers. So I would say that if you had to choose one among the three, then definitely go for slingers as your long range option, and your Galatian skirmishers as your early skirmisher option. Apart from that, as the Galatians, as promised, I am going to be discussing about the deficiencies in their roster, and quite clearly, as you can tell, a missile category is a significantly deficient category in the Galatian roster, so definitely focus on getting AOR and mercenary missile troops such as Grecian archers, which are close by. You also have access to Rhodian slingers. You also have access to Syrian archers, and if you go further up north along the Black Sea, you can get access to some Scythian archers, which are quite good. Those guys have some melee capabilities with, of course, axe entry, which means they have a lot of armor piercing, which is also useful because once you expend their missiles, you can also use them as anti-armor infantry, which is quite good, especially if you're up against heavily armored units. Apart from that, you have some Agrianian Peltas and Thracian Peltas, but once again, the Agrianian and Thracian Peltas are not going to be as good, of course, as your Galatian naked warriors. So you do have an option when it comes to skirmishers, but not much going on for you when it comes to long-range options. Next up, we have cavalry, and we're basically going to discuss both melee and the missile cavalry all together because they're pretty much all useless, but once again you're going to be focusing on asymmetric warfare when it comes to cavalry, and this option right here is your Galatian noble cavalry, 100 men strong, coming from that population class 1. It's the exact same as the general option, so we're not going to be covering them. Meanwhile, you have 2 options that I consider to be viable. You have the Galatian medium cavalry. This is of course a melee cavalry with spear entry. Pretty mediocre stats considering it's a spear cavalry. 18 armor, which is rather low, and for that low value of armor they have really slow speed at 7, so I wouldn't really recommend getting these guys. They're 100 men per unit also, which is kind of like debuff for them, because at least if they were 120 men, then I kind of would have understood the lower stats or the mediocre stats for this unit. But they're just 100 men, and of course they're not going to be able to do well against some of your competing cavalry in the region, so I wouldn't really recommend using these guys. However, the missile cavalry option, your Galatian light cavalry, 120 men in the unit coming from that same population class 2, they have 11 armor, which is not that far behind your medium cavalry. They have much greater speed of 8, and most importantly they have skirmishing capability with 6 javelins, so basically you're going to fight very asymmetrically to your rivals. Your rivals typically will have a lot of heavy cavalry, which means of course your sword cavalry option is not going to be able to do much against them, which is why I've never really covered that unit in specific. But what I mean when I say you're going to fight asymmetrically is you're going to try to kite the enemy using your quickly moving Galatian light cavalry, of course. And then you're going to use your Galatian naked spear warriors to kind of assist your cavalry. So you're going to basically try to get an enemy to give chase. And once they give chase, you technically would have a... Let me just quickly show it over here. So you pretty much have a line like this. And let's just say this is going to be your enemy cavalry. Alright, let's quickly do it. Let's just select all of this so they take less time to move up. There we go. Alright, so what you're going to do is you're pretty much just hit that J key so these guys are facing in the right direction. So just to give an idea, you're going to be, let's slow down the speed again. You're going to be trying to kite these guys, throwing your javelins, of course. And now these guys are going to try to chase you, of course. And when they try to chase you, you're just basically going to move a little bit away. Make sure you select both of them to move at the same time so that they move through each other seamlessly, as you see. And there you have it. These guys are going to get pretty much, trapped in here, of course. And as they're standing, they're going to be a lot harder. And now once these guys are behind, of course, these guys are not going to move through because they're not going to be friendly units. They're going to get bogged down within the spear unit, kind of like so. It's going to be a hodgepodge over here. You're going to see more of this in part 3 of the guide. Basically, this cavalry can start to continue to pelt these guys with the javelins. You can decide to kind of, move around so that you can get your javelins off on the unshielded side of the cavalry. And now once this cavalry decides to run away because they realize they're not going to be doing so well against spear units, what you can do is actually give chase with your Galatian light cavalry. And now your Galatian light cavalry, having that speed of 8, is going to have an advantage because these guys are not going to be able to escape your Galatian light cavalry. And what's more is that even though these guys are heavily armored, as opposed to your Galatian medium infantry, just take a look at the weapon damage. So your Galatian medium infantry has a weapon damage of 31, 5 of which is armor piercing, versus your Galatian light cavalry has an overall weapon damage of 31 again, but 12 of which is armor piercing. So these guys are actually really good at armor piercing. So if I just go ahead and switch them into melee mode. Okay, so they don't really show their axes, but I'm pretty sure they have axes, which means these guys are going to be able to shred heavily armored enemy cavalry that's trying to escape from them. And they're not going to be too successful at escaping because, of course, they have that speed of 8. So that's why I kind of like the Galatian Naked Warriors, because they are very, very versatile unit. Once these guys are done dispatching the enemy cavalry, they can also engage with enemy infantry. Another thing you can do is, let's say this cavalry decides that it's no longer able to engage this spear unit and is losing decisively. They're going to try to run away. But when they try to run away, you don't have to actually chase with your Galatian Naked Warriors because they're not going to be able to catch up to a cavalry unit. What you can do is just ask them to throw a volley of javelins into the backs of these cavalrymen, and that will also inflict a lot of damage on this cavalry unit. So, and keep in mind, javelins actually have a bonus versus cavalry units. So that being said, we have covered up all of the cavalry options for the Galatians. Of course, the final options is the special units, and we have 2 chariot options. The first is your Galatian chariots. These are a very light chariot unit, 60 men in the unit, coming from that population class 2. Not a very good unit in my opinion. When it comes to chariots, chariots are a glass cannon. What this means is that they can dish out a lot of damage, but at the same time they can also take, or basically be destroyed with a lot of damage, or less damage rather, so to speak, because like a glass, it can easily shatter. And now the reason why that is just because of the CA mechanics. It's nothing to do with divided Impera. Chariots are either OP or they're absolutely trash. And what it means is that this chariot, especially since it's a light chariot, it's not going to be able to push through densely formed infantry units, so it's going to get bogged down a lot. And chariots, if they get bogged down, they take a lot of damage, and they're very easy to lose a lot of units. And now keep in mind that this unit is 60 men strong, which means if it loses 20 units, it might not seem big in the grand scheme of things. When your entire army is, let's say, 300 or 3,000 men strong, losing 20 units might seem like nothing. But individually speaking, With this chariot unit, of course, you get, or with any unit in the game, your morale really depends on the number of units you have within that regiment. And of course, 20 of these units lost basically means you are now almost at 50% of unit strength, which kind of significantly affects your morale. So these guys, not so good. I wouldn't recommend getting them. However, when it comes to the next unit, or the final unit of this guide, we're talking about the Galatian side chariots. Now these guys are really good. They're super heavy chariot. The only drawback is that they are limited. You do not get unlimited access to these units. To gain these units, of course, they come from that population class 1. They are nobility chariot. However, to gain this unit, you have to own the settlement of Antiochia, which happens to be the capital of the mighty Seleucid Empire. So you're not going to be able to access these guys earlier on in the campaign. However, later on in the campaign, when the Seleucid Empire eventually crumbles because it's being attacked on all sides by the Ptolemies and, of course, its own satrapies after the satrapy rebellion triggers, you can safely join the battle. And of course, Antiochia is closest located to you, which means you have a high probability of acquiring the settlement, after which you can recruit these units. They are quite good. They're super heavy chariots, which means they can easily run through an enemy formation, which means it's going to be a lot easier to keep these guys on the move. However, these guys have even lesser number of men in the unit, 25 men in the unit, which means if you lose even 10 of these guys, that's almost, once again, 50% of the entire unit, and these guys will absolutely shatter because it's easy to lose 10 units really quickly, especially if you are, if there's a javelin volley that kind of decimates chariots, because javelins have an additional impact versus chariot units because of the dense horses and the horse formations, and horses tend to be really susceptible to javelin fire. So chariots in turn are incredibly vulnerable to javelin fire. However, if you keep chariots on the move, especially super heavy chariots like this, pretty much they're unstoppable and you can rack up a lot of kills. You will take a few casualties. That's not avoidable as a chariot unit. Very rarely in a battle have I ever had a chariot unit that has taken no casualties. However, in a battle you will end up losing 1 or 2 of your chariots out of 25, and that's okay as long as it's not more than 5 to 10, obviously, considering the size of this unit, because then they will suffer a significant morale penalty. However, that being said and done, we are done, finally done with part 1 of the guide. So let us hop into part 2. Alright, so here we are in the second part of this guide series, in which we will be talking about my personal recommendation for the army composition against a typical Roman Marian legionary. And of course, the Roman Marian legionary is actually a hard counter to the Galatian faction, because as I covered in the previous part of this guide, the Galatians are heavily infantry focused, and of course the Romans have the best infantry in the game, so they're basically negating our strengths. However, we will keep that in mind and we will build up our army based on that composition. Of course, you could make a slight few adjustments to your army composition, because it won't be long until long in the campaign where you'll actually have to fight out against the Romans. However, for the most part, we are going to be focusing on our strengths and trying to counter the Roman strengths. So straight off the bat, the very first thing we need to select is our general unit. Now, I prefer the Galatian noble cavalry because they are really good against enemy infantry, and I will be using our general quite a fair bit to deal with enemy skirmisher units. Of course, after that, we will have to build up our front line, and for our front line I am going to be going with our Galatian legionaries. Now, these guys are not as good as Roman legionaries. Of course, they are slightly more attack oriented as opposed to our Roman legionaries that are more defensively oriented, and they do have better armor piercing value in comparison to our Galatian legionaries themselves. However, the Galatian legionaries are pretty good against Romans or against most of the infantry, so nothing to scoff at. They're still going to be able to hold their ground quite well. Now, apart from that, I'm going to get a couple of naked warriors. Now, these guys are extremely useful units as covered in the previous part of this guide. And I will be using, quite surprisingly, our light cavalry in order to counter Roman cavalry, which is actually really powerful. As you can tell, they have 41 armor as opposed to our light cavalry is not that capable of dealing with that cavalry, but we are going to showcase how I basically use this cavalry to counter the Roman cavalry. And of course, this cavalry unit also has a lot of armor piercing damage, which is quite good as a counter against the high armor values of the Marian legionary. Of course, if I go ahead and use the best cavalry, melee cavalry option available to me, the Galatian noble cavalry, they're not going to do that well. They do have decent armor, but of course, stat for stat, they're not as good as the Marian legionary cavalry. And keep in mind, the Marian legionary cavalry is a spear cavalry, so they do have a lot of bonus versus cavalry. Meanwhile, our cavalry, which is the Galatian noble cavalry, is an infantry, anti-infantry cavalry. So definitely you don't want to be using these guys up against Roman cavalry. That is straight up going to defeat your cavalry. Next up, what we want is we want a lot of axemen to kind of counter the Roman heavily armored units like the legionaries as well as the auxiliary units. Of course, even their archers have 38 armor, and of course even their skirmishers have 20 armor, so really high armor values on the Roman units over here, and our axemen will actually come in clutch in dealing with those units. And as you can tell, for the most part, we have pretty much gone with just population class 2 so far, with the exception of course our general coming from population class 1. So now it's time to get some population class 1 units, and of course we are going to go for the Galatian thorax infantry, which is the best infantry available to us. Of course, they are from that population class 1, which means it's not going to be that easy to replenish them in the campaign map, but keep in mind that since we are predominantly using population class 2, especially for our cavalry in this instance, which typically tends to be population class 1 with the other factions, we can focus on using population class 1 instead for our infantry. And for the last 2 remaining slots, I am going to go for the Galatian sides chariots. Now these chariots are really powerful if used right, so definitely these are the last 2 remaining pop 1 classes that I'm going to use. And before I go ahead and hop into the into the battle, I'm just quickly going to arrange my units in the formation that I want them to be in, so that it's going to be a lot easier to organize them in the battle or the campaign battle map. That being said and done, I think what I might end up doing is I could reduce a single unit over here, maybe get another Galatian legionary. That might be more useful, and have a couple of axemen on either flank. That being said and done, I'm pretty happy with the army composition. Of course, we have our Galatian thorax infantry that will be protecting the flanks of our Galatian legionaries. You know what, I'm actually going to reduce one of them and just go for a little bit more axemen. I mean, it's pretty much the same if I replace this with a legionary unit, because it's population class 2, they're 200 men, so there's no real difference of getting one or the other, but I'm going to keep a couple of units in reserve. However, that being said and done, let us hop into the battle and I will show you how to deal with your typical Marian Roman legionary. Alright, welcome to part 3 of this guide, in which we will be facing off against the Roman legions. We're going to go ahead and group all of our units. We're going to turn off the fire at will for the chariots so that they don't throw javelins at each other and cause friendly fire. Meanwhile, all of our light cavalry is going to be on skirmish mode. We're going to try to kite the Roman heavy cavalry. We're going to select our 2 naked spearmen, our front line. Meanwhile, we're going to select all of them, increase their width to the maximum width possible, and finally we're going to select all of our axemen. And so with all of our axemen selected, we're going to make them into the narrowest width possible, and we're going to move both of them onto the flanks over there. And of course, we're going to keep one over here as a reserve, just in case. However, that being said and done, let's move our cavalry onto the flanks. Go ahead, keep a unit of spear units, reduce their width just by a little bit, keep the chariots supporting that left flank. Meanwhile, on the right flank, we're going to get another cavalry unit over there, a naked spear unit as well to support, and of course a general's unit over there. We have one cavalry unit over here. Yes, should be here. Perfect. With that, the formation seems to be fine. And of course, if we take a look at the tactical map, as you can see, we have our front line over here. We have our axemen to kind of counter and charge. We have a huge gap over here that can be exploited by the Romans, and that gap will keep widening, so the Romans could exploit and flank our front line, but we have a lot of support units in reserve. We have a general and we have some chariots to help out in case that happens. Meanwhile, the objective is to use our support troops in order to lure the Romans into an unfavorable engagement. That being said and done, for the most part, as you can see, the first 4 groups are usually my cavalry groups, since it's easier to micromanage them, as group 1, 2, 3, 4 is really close to your left hand, especially for since your left hand is going to be positioned ideally above the ASWD key, which is used to rotate and move your camera. And of course, the remaining of my troops are all infantry, and we are going to make sure that we toggle on that guard mode. So without any further ado, let's go ahead, start the battle. We're going to move our front lines by holding down that control key, so they're going to move slowly, they're going to get into position. Meanwhile, what we are going to do is we are going to move our cavalry as well really quickly on either flanks. Let's go ahead, keep doing that. And our spearmen are also going to get there. Meanwhile, our chariots are going to be close behind. Our general is also going to be close behind. Get our spearmen over there. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to get in range, but not too much in range, of the enemy missile units. And for the most part, the Romans have really heavily armored units, so there's no real point. As you can tell, I haven't gone for long-range missile infantry because our missile infantry as the Galatians is pathetic. However, let's just pause here before the skirmishing phase begins. So in comparison to the Romans, they definitely have a lot of armor, like the Italian auxiliary archers over here have 38 armor. Meanwhile, their skirmishers might seem to have less armor at only 20, but they do have massive shields, so they are able to tank missile damage. So in a skirmish versus skirmish phase, we are not going to be winning that, guys. So there is no point of getting long-range missile units. Of course, in the campaign, you can go for better missile units like your Cretan archers or your Rhodian slingers, or even your Scythian archers or your Syrian archers. But as far as this battle is concerned, of course, that's going to be pretty much useless. Now what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to engage the Roman cavalry over here. We're going to try to force them to get into a fight, and of course, once you get close enough, the whole army is going to move about, start to reposition, start to reanalyze their pathfinding and so forth. So what we are going to try to do is we are going to try to just try to get some positional supremacy over here. So as long as they're doing this, that's fine. What I really want is for their cavalry to commit into this engagement, because then I can pretty much isolate them. So that is pretty much what I am trying to do over here. Meanwhile, on the left flank, there is no cavalry, so I don't need to be aggressive. Here on the right flank, I'm trying to be aggressive. Their archers are not yet engaged, which is kind of good. Meanwhile, the entire front line is being threatened, so let's just pull back our front line a little bit. Go ahead, pull back our cavalry as well. They are going to be attacked. Get our spearmen over here, and they can go ahead and charge over there. Meanwhile, on the left flank, nothing much is happening. What we want to do is keep moving our cavalry, keep moving our spearmen over here. We want to be able to catch this unit off guard. Meanwhile, we're going to move our general into a position where he can potentially deal with this unit. And already, as you can see, we are, having a slight advantage. We're going to keep moving our entire front line behind. Try not to get too caught out. Meanwhile, this archer unit is trying to get into position. We're going to try over here to attack. Get that cavalry isolated. Okay, meanwhile, our entire front line, we're going to deny the enemy the opportunity to attack us very quickly. And here we go. We have a unit of horsemen that are trying to make a move for us. So we're going to move our general towards them, and we're going to use our chariots as well to counter them. Meanwhile, over here we have a bunch of archers that have gotten out of position, so we're going to try our level best to attack them. Over here, our cavalry and our spearmen have engaged. We're going to pull out our cavalry through the spearmen. Go ahead, attack these guys over here. Hopefully we don't take a lot of friendly fire from the javelins. We go ahead, attack this archer unit. We took quite a lot of friendly damage from our infantry, so that was rather unfortunate. But we have managed to deal with that one cavalry unit, which is a rather good thing. Meanwhile, over here, we are still struggling, so we are trying to pull out our cavalry. And we might actually give chase now since they are wavering. So let's just go ahead and do that. Meanwhile, we did manage to take care of one of the archers, so already this battle is looking quite good. We're going to pull out our general real quick over here. Unfortunately, our chariots did manage to take some damage. We're gonna reposition over here, get rid of another cavalry unit, which is absolutely amazing. So that's definitely good news. Pull back our cavalry over here. Go ahead, charge this one over here. Cavalry needs to pull back. It's kind of strange because I have them on skirmisher mode, so they should be able to do that autonomously, but unfortunately they're not. So that is rather unfortunate. And we're going to move our chariots real close over there as well. Meanwhile, just move up our entire infantry again. Try to engage the enemy. Very quickly over here. We're going to pull out our cavalry, get across. These guys can go ahead, charge over there. Meanwhile, our chariots can also charge once again. We want to turn off the fire at will, definitely, so that we don't take any unnecessary damage. We're going to pull back over here. We have another unit over here. These are javelins and they can cause some serious damage. However, there you have it. Okay, our chariots are starting to make some moves over here and we are going to charge as well. We're going to keep moving our chariots. And of course, these guys are going to keep retreating, which is great. We're going to pull back even more. So we're hoping to get this enemy off guard. That is actually an archer unit. So our chariots have done quite well over here. We're going to pull back, going to move our skirmishers behind, and we're going to move our chariots all the way to the back. This archer unit is kind of out of position, which means we can charge now effectively. Our cavalry is going to give chase to this cavalry. We can turn on the fire at will once again. Can move our chariots all the way at the back. So chariots took a little bit of damage. We lost quite a bit of troops. However, we have managed to deal with all of the enemy auxilia for the most part. So there's not much they can do about this. Meanwhile, we're going to move our spearmen all the way up. Considering that the enemy support is completely gone, we're going to start moving up our infantry as well, because we will get ready for phase 2 of this battle. Things are looking quite good in terms of our cavalry doing quite well as well. So nothing much going on over here. We're going to pull back all the way. So our basic battle is looking quite good already. We've taken a bit of losses, but we have managed to get rid of 2 Roman archers. And of course we have managed to get rid of pretty much all of the Roman cavalry except their general. So I'd say it's a fair trade-off in my opinion. Meanwhile, what we can do is we can try to get the Roman general to commit over here. That would actually be a massive, massive deal. What we are going to do is, once again, we're going to pull back our infantry. Now the enemy really doesn't have any range, so that's actually really good. And what we are going to do over here, we're going to try to get to the Roman general. Really try to get to him.
One of our units has used all its ammunition.
Alright. Pretty happy with that. Let's pull back. Come on, pull back. Get our spearmen all the way there. And these spearmen can come all the way here. Okay, we're done with all of our javelins over here. So this cavalry is now pretty much just going to be anti-missile units, I guess. And I think it is time to just commit now and pin down the enemy units. So let's just move up our infantry real quick. Try to engage the enemy as much as we can. Try to start to encircle them a little bit. Get into position for that. Meanwhile, we can move our chariots up ahead. We can move our general as well. So now we are finally getting into position. We want to start running so that we, mitigate the time that these skirmishers have against us. and we also want to maximize the time we have against them, so so that we can get our javelins off as quickly as possible. Okay, perfect. Alright, let's make sure that we throw in all of our javelins. Go ahead, get into position quickly, try to engage the enemy over here. Push up, push up, push up. And we are going to try our level best to keep harassing the enemy general. Very quickly going to get into position over here. Keep trying to harass the enemy. Go ahead, keep attacking. And there we go. Now it's time to actually enable our defensive formation. Go ahead, enable it. Get our axemen all the way up. Good. And we're gonna get our chariots into the fray as well. Get both of our spearmen. We can actually merge them now since we don't have a lot of cavalry to deal with. Okay, the front lines are looking quite good, except this unit's getting a little bit pelted. Get our chariots all the way up there. Get our axemen up and running. Hurry up. And now it might be tempting to, kind of move with this unit, but, for the most part, we're gonna have to be a little bit patient with that. Because the problem is it could get out of position, and it is being pelted a lot by these skirmisher units, and that, to be honest, is the real danger as far as I'm concerned. Meanwhile, we move our general up, we get into position, make sure that this skirmisher unit is kind of isolated. Go ahead, charge over here. We're gonna move up this unit as well. We're gonna charge into this. So our cavalry is gotten into position. Go ahead, charge all of these skirmisher units. Get our spear skirmishers into position. And now that this unit is absolutely free, it can also start to maneuver, which is great. And we have a reserve unit, so we can also dedicate that over there. Meanwhile, our general can go ahead, support that skirmisher unit. We're gonna move this unit over here a little bit. Go ahead, charge this unit. Get our chariots into position. And this is just perfect because we have our spearmen right here to take care of the enemy general. Meanwhile, these cavalry is going to go ahead, attack over here, move up over here. These guys can go ahead and attack this unit. It's already starting to waver, and of course the general is losing decisively. So as you can see, we have managed to completely encircle the enemy almost. Of course, they do have a last battalion or whatever, bastion over here in the center, but we are going to use our chariots quite effectively to counter them. We're going to keep pushing and keep moving, using the movement keys over here to keep moving the chariots. And as you can tell, it's absolutely a slogfest over here. We managed to completely wipe out the Roman army, and of course there's nothing much they can do. It's an instantaneous and quick victory. Managed to completely encircle the Roman army over here. So really well fought out battle. We haven't taken a lot of losses, guys, and I will see you all in the post-battle analysis. So as you can see, guys, we were extremely inferior in comparison to the Roman army. Of course, cavalry for cavalry, they had better cavalry, better armor, better anti-cavalry, but of course we used our cavalry very smart. We used our light cavalry to bait in the Roman cavalry, and we used our very versatile naked spearmen to deal with the enemy general and to deal with his cavalry units. Of course, as I said, the most deadly Roman unit were the skirmisher units. I absolutely hate them. They have 20 armor, which is insane. And of course, they tend to stick closer to their infantry unit because they have shorter range, so they're very hard to kind of isolate from the main enemy army. So of course they're going to be doing a lot of damage. Meanwhile, their archers absolutely did nothing. Even though we didn't have any long range units to counter these units, we managed to effectively neutralize them with two great charges with our lighter cavalry. And of course these cavalry does have a lot of armor piercing value as well, so a lot of the 38 armor of the Italian auxiliary archers was pointless, and of course they can't fight back as effectively against cavalry units. Meanwhile, our chariots, we didn't use them 100% to their potential, but we did use them quite well. We managed to effectively use them against cavalry units. Unfortunately, they took a lot of damage because our front line threw their javelins against our own chariots, which caused a lot of friendly fire, and we lost about 5 chariots in that engagement. Meanwhile, our general did quite well. But if you look at these stats, of course, stat for stat, we did much better. Of course, we lost only 300 men. We managed to kill 1,469 Romans. So we basically killed 4 times our numbers. And if I let this battle continue, guys, I could have absolutely wiped out the Roman army, because let's take a quick look over here. We managed to almost wipe out their entire cavalry, and I think we did wipe out their general because the enemy general died. Apart from that, we wiped out their archers, we wiped out a complete skirmisher unit, we almost wiped out the other skirmisher unit, and pretty much all of these units, they seem to be at full HP, and they seem to have escaped the battle. But if I continued the battle and I gave chase to these units, they're all heavy units running at speed 2. They would not be able to outrun my super fast chariots as well as my super fast light cavalry. So definitely these guys could have pretty much killed the remaining 2,300 Romans that survived the initial onslaught, which basically means you could divide up those kills between the chariots as well as the light cavalry. So you're looking at about 6 units sharing around 2,000 casualties. And of course, 2,000 divided by 6, that's about 330 per unit. So of course your chariots can rack up 500 kills. Of course your cavalry can also rack up around 400 kills each. So yeah, there you have it, guys. You can see for the most part we have absolutely dominated this battle. And as far as speaking of our own casualties is concerned, you can tell we barely took any casualties to our first class population. Our Thoracitai swordsmen took very few casualties. Of course, our general took no casualties, and that goes in line with what I was saying in part 1 of this guide, and that you want to use your general very effectively, very carefully. Still try to get as many kills as you possibly can, but try to be in a very safe position with your general. Of course, when it comes to population class 1, our chariots took most of the damage, and most of it is actually from friendly fire from our front line. And speaking of our front line, you can see that our legionaries actually did quite well against the Romans. They did use that defensive formation to kind of try to slow down the Roman offensive against us. Unfortunately, one of the legions took, or one of the cohorts took quite a bit of damage from missile fire. It was unengaged, but it did manage to participate in some flanking maneuvers. And you have to be patient in those regards. It might seem like a bad thing that you're losing a lot of men in that unit because it's staying back and the enemy is pelting you, but you got to be patient. You got to trust in your tactics, and you eventually will pull through once the entire enemy decided to engage. Of course, my axemen performed flanking maneuvers, and as you can tell, our axemen did manage to get quite a lot of kills. Of course, they could have gotten a lot more. They did do, in all fairness, they did do a lot more kills than our frontline units, because these guys did have that flanking opportunity, as well as they have the armor piercing, which is a direct counter to high armored units like the Roman units we have over here. But of course, they didn't do a lot more damage than what I expected. I expected these guys to rack up 100 kills each, but the reason they didn't do that is because we ended the battle super quick when we kind of used our chariots. Pretty much once the front lines clashed, I can guarantee you that although this battle duration seems like 12 minutes, we managed to wrap up the battle within 2 or 3 minutes once the two front lines clashed. So that is just how powerful the Galatian army is. The synergy, especially if you use it right, especially if you focus on that maneuverability, especially if you try to bait enemy cavalry around, try to get them into bad positions. And I hope you guys kind of enjoy this kind of battle, because it's one of the more unique battles in my opinion. However, that being said and done, let's hop on to the next section, where I will be covering some of the AOR mercenary units that I personally recommend that complement the Galatian roster, especially in the missile department. Alright, welcome to part 4 and the final part of this guide. In this section we will be talking about my personal recommendations for the general skills as well as of course the army traditions. And as the Galatians, let us first cover the general skills. In the general skills, of course, we will go for the military logistician to improve the upkeep cost for our army, as well as of course the military conscriptor that improves our replenishment rate for all of the units. Of course, these are the two most standard general skills that I normally get because they are just simply that powerful. Minus 15% upkeep for all land units makes it so that elitist units cost as much as warrior class units, and warrior class units cost as much as levy tier units, and so forth. So as you can tell, it will allow you to maintain a lot more armies as well as get a lot more elite units without having to pay exorbitant upkeep costs. Meanwhile, the military conscriptor, which improves the replenishment rates, allows it so that your army is able to replenish within 1 or 2 turns, allowing you to maintain your momentum in your offensive campaigns. Next up, as the Galatians, you want to focus on getting the ferocious warrior, and in specific you are going to focus on these two abilities over here to improve your swordsman. As you know, the Galatians are a melee heavy faction, so we are going to get the trained swordsman that improves melee attack and melee defense for all infantry units, and this does not only mean sword units but also spear units as well. Apart from that, we can also get the drill master, which improves the levy units ability, and since most of your population class 3 units are actually levy tier units, such as of course your spearmen as well as of course your Galatian swordsmen themselves, they will greatly benefit from those bonuses. Apart from that, it also improves the movement speed of your units by 6%, which is kind of important, especially as the Galatians, you are going to be focusing on being as mobile as possible on the battlefield, as you saw in the previous part of the guide. Then you could get the skilled cavalryman that improves your cavalry combat ability. However, I do not recommend this because you do not have access to a lot of cavalry as the Galatians, and of course you want to primarily focus on your infantry. You could also get the experienced archer, which improves all missile infantry and missile units, including missile cavalry. However, once again, I do not recommend this as the Galatians because you will not be having a lot of missile units in your army, with the exception, of course, of the naked spearmen and so forth. What I would really recommend as the Galatians, let's go ahead and actually open it up over here so it's a bit more clear. You can go for the commander of men next and focus on getting the movement speed for all of the units. And that is going to be very crucial because once again you want to stay as mobile as possible as the Galatians. And next up, you could get the Dread Commander, which gives a morale penalty for all enemy units. Keep in mind the Galatians do not have access to any units with the Fear ability, and since you want to crush the enemy as quickly as you possibly can, of course, as you saw in the previous section of this guide, in the battle we were able to do so once we initiated our chariot charge. However, with the Dread Commander ability, we will be able to do that even more quickly. If you consider the battle that took place in the previous part of the guide, you will know that despite the battle taking about 12 minutes, pretty much the core of the battle in which our front lines engaged lasted less than 3 minutes out of those 12 minutes, because the initial 9 minutes was all about skirmishing and trying to get an advantage with our support troops so that we can easily encircle and swallow up the enemy formation as a whole once our front line engaged. Last, you have a ability that you could take. Now in this ability you could take several abilities. It's really up for grabs. Of course, you could get the defensive morale skilled tactician. Wouldn't really recommend going down this route. I mean, night battles is quite nice, but of course you only have one more slot left, so you can't really do much over there. You can only get skilled tactician, which would give your general a bit more cunning, and it would give morale on defensive battles, which is not that great because ideally you shouldn't be on the defensive and you should fight most of your battles on the offensive. And in my opinion, morale is not that important. I mean, it is, don't get me wrong, but there are so many things you can do to counter morale, such as flanking and of course inflicting a lot of casualties in a short span of time. And as long as you're not suffering either one of these things, then morale shouldn't be a problem in any campaign. Apart from that, I mean, the effective ambusher is quite nice because it gives you an increased chance of launching an ambush. An ambush is quite a good part of a mobile style strategy, because you don't have a dedicated front line, so you kind of want to deny the enemy from having that dedicated front line. But again, with ambush you will have to fight a lot of defensive battles, which ties in nicely with the skilled tactician. And once again, with ambush I only use it in dire circumstances, when I need to dislodge an enemy from protecting a settlement. However, for the most part, ambushes form a vast minority of the battles that you will face. So once again, it's not really that great. And of course, Siegecraft Expert is really not that great, especially it just offers some bonuses to besieging settlements, and apart from that, not much. So it's really up for grabs what you want to do. You could go for something like the Quartermaster, which gives you additional ammunition for all of your missile units, which means all of your units get quite a significant amount of ammunition, especially your naked spearmen, which will serve as a versatile skirmisher unit. So that's one way to go about it. Apart from that, you could go for cavalry or archers, so it's really up to you guys what you want to go for with this final skill. But me personally, I will be going for the mercenary connection, and that is because as the Galatians, you will be focusing on getting mercenaries to complement the deficiencies in your army. Namely, of course, you want to get some cavalry units, as well as of course you want to get some long-range missile units, such as Rhodian slingers, Cretan archers, Syrian archers, Sarmatian archers. And of course, when it comes to cavalry, you could go for the Cappadocian lancers, Armenian Azad noble cavalrymen, and of course you could also go for Persian cavalry, as well as some steppe nomadic cataphracts and heavy horse archers. So definitely you will be hiring quite a lot of mercenaries. At least 25% to 50% of your army will be composed of mercenary units, and of course this minus 15% hiring cost really stacks up. Apart from that, the plus 15 morale for all mercenary units is kind of important. I know I kind of said that morale isn't all that important, but in the case of mercenaries, morale is quite important, because with mercenaries, what you typically want to do is you can be a little bit more relaxed with the casualties they take. You can play them a little bit more offensively, a bit more riskily. You can sacrifice those units because you don't really care about their replenishment, so long as of course they don't get wiped out from the battlefield. Even if they take 50% casualties or so forth, you are easily going to be able to replenish mercenaries. So having a lot of mercenary morale ensures that these mercenary units, despite taking a lot of casualties, will stay in the battle and will not break. So it is quite important for mercenary units. But with your own units, typically you do not want to get to a point where morale benefits are really necessary. So you want to be a lot more smart when using your own core roster, so that they don't take a lot of damage, they don't take a lot of casualties, so that you can easily replenish in the turns to come. However, that being said and done, let us move on to the army traditions. And in the army traditions, the first thing you want to get is the Wolves of North. This gives increased melee attack for all of the units, which is really important. Apart from that, you want to get Formidable Spearmen. This will give improved melee attack skill for all your spear armed units. And finally, you want to get the Indomitable Infantry, which is unlocked by the Formidable Spearmen, and this basically improves the melee attack and melee defense for all infantry units across the board by 9% each. Next up, you want to get the Rapine Plunderers. Not really much of a benefit of the Rapine Plunderers. Once again, just a couple of siege benefits. But after that, you want to go for the Frontier Conquerors. This gives you a bit of campaign range movement, and that's not really that important in my opinion. The morale in foreign territory, again, not that important, but what is important is that it unlocks the Legacy of Brennus. Now, the Legacy of Brennus, as you can see, not only gives you 15% income from looting settlements, which kind of ties in nicely with your factional bonus if you remember, it gives you, more importantly, +3 weapon damage inflicted by all army units. Now these weapon damage increments are some of the strongest army traditions that you can possibly get, because they can significantly improve the damage dealing potential of your units. Next up, you want to get the Hearth Bear Guard. This actually gives melee defense skill for all of your units, and after that you want to go for the Stalwart Heart Defenders. Gives you a few bonuses if you're under siege, and that's not that important. However, what is important is that it unlocks the Unfettered Warriors. Now the Unfettered Warriors gives you a boost once again to all of your melee abilities for your infantry unit, that is +9 melee attack as well as +9% melee defense, and more importantly it even gives more movement speed for all of the units within your army. Lastly, you want to get the Chieftain's Chosen, which is the special army tradition available to the Celtic factions, and what this does is once again gives you a whopping 3% weapon damage inflicted by all army units and a +6 morale for all units. So after we have done that, I know it might seem that we have to get some more skills, but as you can see we're maxed out, and that is because I've actually modded in the number of skills in turn 1 through Save Passer, so that I can quickly display how to skill up your army as well as your general skills. Now after we have applied all of this, let's take a quick look, and as you can see, mercenaries a lot cheaper to recruit, only 1900. And of course, if we take a look at some of our units, you can see our Levitier unit, it should have 7 melee attack, 17 melee defense, and an overall weapon damage of 26. So keep that in mind when we look at what the reality is now. So as you can see, the reality has jumped up from 7 melee attack to 11 melee attack, and of course if we take a look at the melee defense, from 17 it has jumped all the way up to 27, which is absolutely insane. Overall weapon damage from 26 has jumped up to 28, which is amazing. And of course the speed has also increased from a 3 speed to a 4 speed, which is really good considering you want really mobile armies as the Galatians. Apart from that, you will get a lot of bonuses when it comes to some of your other units as well, such as your Naked Warriors. As you can see, it will effectively even improve their abilities quite significantly. We have the Naked Spearmen over here, so as you can see, the melee attack of 19, melee defense of 22, overall weapon damage 33, that is insane. And of course the morale of 74 is absolutely nuts. They get an extra ammunition as well, 5 javelins instead of 4, and now 5 javelins actually make them equal to skirmisher, purely dedicated skirmisher units, in that they have 8,000 javelins per unit. However, that being said and done, I am done with this guide. I hope you all liked the video, and if you enjoyed the video, then don't forget to like and subscribe if you are interested for more. Peace and love.